My name is Addison Field. I'm the Chief Curator of the Alaska State Museums. Thank you for coming tonight. I'd like to start by thanking the Okwan of the Tlingit Nation, in whose homeland we hold this meeting tonight, and in whose village site we are currently gathered. So fittingly, it was in a coffee shop in Anchorage back in 2017 where our speaker tonight first told me about her project to have the Naknek Cannery listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and would the museum be interested in partnering on that project and maybe doing an exhibit. And here we are. That's 5 years later that we're opening Mug Up, the Language of Work, Language of Cannery Work. Like the Pacific Salmon, Katie Ringsmuth journeyed to Bristol Bay each spring with her dad, Gary Johnson, who was the Diamond NN Cannery Superintendent. As a cannery kid, she rode three-wheelers and ate too many mug-up donuts. In later years, Katie worked her way through school, packing salmon roe and sliming fish. The experience not only paid for college, but inspired her pursuit of Alaska history. In 2015, she learned that Trident Seafood had closed the Diamond NN Cannery. Katie, along with Bob King, Carvel and Shirley Zimmern, Tim Troll, Larice Egley, and many others, launched the NN Cannery History Project to collect, preserve, and share the oft-forgotten stories of Alaska's cannery people. Today, Katie teaches Alaska history at the University of Alaska Anchorage and serves as the Alaska State Historian and Deputy Historic Preservation Officer. She lives in Eagle River with her husband Eric and two soccer-playing boys, Ben and Tom. Please give a warm welcome to the exhibit curator, Katie Ringsmuth.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out. I think I have to stay here. Can you guys hear me all okay? Yeah, when I teach, I wander, back and forth. So, and I think I'm stuck here because we're live, so I can't be recorded. So I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a special night. 7 years in the making, actually many more, I think over 50 years in the making. The NN Cannery History Project started as a grassroots public history endeavor that, through the historical lens of cannery work, aimed to share the oft-forgotten stories of the multitudes of people who can salmon in Alaska and created an ethnically diverse, economically vital cannery culture. So as Addison said, my name is Katie Ringsmuth. I teach Alaska history at UAA, state historian and all that, but I was also a cannery worker. I was a slimer. And I had the honor of curating this extraordinary exhibit, Mug Up, the Language of Work. And in every photo that you see of me, you'll find that for some reason I never ever once brushed my hair, apparently. like all the documentaries, I'm like, what was I thinking? God, yeah, you know that they had someone at least brushing the back of their hair, but So the idea of the NN Cannery Project gained momentum, as Addison said, in 2015 when word spread that the current owner of the cannery, Trident Seafoods, decided to permanently close the old NN Cannery and at South Naknek. And this actually came as stunning news for a handful of us, our fish heads, our fishtorians, as you call it. And I remember Bob King. Bob, where are you? There he is, Bob King. Yes, give Bob a... So Bob King and I, we were at this history conference in Cordova, and we were really discussing how the cannery connected Bristol Bay to this extensive community and global web. And the more we talked, the more we really began to understand what this all meant. And the closure of the APA Diamond NN Cannery really marked the end of an era. Bob and I then, in these kind of crazy fits and starts, we assembled a team that included cannery experts, historians, curators, artists, architects, cultural bearers, residents, even filmmakers from Juneau to Naknek, some of whom are here tonight. And we named ourselves the NN Cannery History Project. Although we had a first name, it was canned with an exclamation point, which is a terrible name. I don't know that was all me. But anyway, we named ourselves the NN Cannery History Project. And together we created a network of well-established public-private partnerships that included everyone from Trident Seafoods, the National Park Service, the State Historic Preservation Officer, the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and Fairbanks, and the digital storytelling consulting business Sea Stories, the Bristol Bay Heritage Land Trust, the Alaska Association for Historic Preservation, and of course, the amazing Alaska State Museum here in Juneau. And the result of this incredible community effort, and when I say community, I really am talking about community that extends from San Francisco Bay all the way to Bristol Bay. An incredible community effort. We had 4 interrelated goals, which we have since accomplished. The first was listing the Diamond NN Cannery on the National Register of Historic Places, the first, and hopefully not the last, cannery in Bristol Bay to get such national designation. We developed a digital storytelling workshop for Bristol Bay School District, because you can do all the history stuff in the world, but if you do not invest in the younger generation to come up and take on that history themselves, then, you know, it's all for naught. So it's important to engage the younger generation. We then also collected oral histories of former cannery workers for publication on UAF's Project Jukebox. So again, researchers can utilize all this research and information for the future. And finally, we produced a museum exhibition that shares the underrepresented history of the cannery people with everyone from Alaska residents to visitors from around the world. So hopefully we'll be able to share our stories with all those cruise ship people who come in, right? That's what we want. So thanks to the very talented, dedicated museum staff, including Anjali. Where's Anjali? There she is. Anjali, Aaron, Addison, Ellen, Steve, Jackie, the archival and library staff, world class. You're so lucky to live here in Juneau and have these folks around you. With the support of Trident Seafoods, who granted us permission to collect these objects. They sent them to Juneau. And a whole container, yep, so all of those objects out there came from the cannery, which is pretty incredible, which is even more incredible that you managed to get it all on display. And of course, the long list of funders from national organizations such as NEH and NPS to local institutions like the Bristol Bay Borough. And the many individuals, like all those corks out there, are names of people who contributed to this project. So every one of those corks represents people who contributed. And finally, after 7 years and a pandemic, we are now ready to share with you this amazing exhibit. So this just shows you. So these are my kids, and yeah, when we first started, and here we are in Salzburg just a few weeks ago. So that just speaks volumes of the time and dedication and commitment that went into this project. And this, that's me, and multiply that by all the other people who contributed and dedicated their time and effort into this. So, indeed, I consider the NN Cannery History Project a professional undertaking, but it's also very, very personal to me because I, too, again, was a cannery worker. I earned my way to go to school. Like I say, I slimed my way through college. And my dad, Gary, he ran the Diamond NN Cannery for 30 years, and when he retired in 1996, he represented the last of the working APA superintendents. Now, that year, the reason why my dad retired was because he was in a traumatic boating accident in Florida. He was eventually transferred up to Harborview in Seattle, and, I was really just a kid right out of college, and and Dad was at Harborview, and this is in Seattle. And what was extraordinary is the fishermen, the processors, the company people, the residents, they all came to see him. And he couldn't even remember my youngest sister. I mean, that's how bad the accident was. It took him many months to recover. But what I remember are the stories that people told in the waiting room about, Gary, the superintendent in tennis shoes, as Trefont called him. And what the doctors told us is to restore that long-term memory, is to do things like, the alphabet, the days of the week. But what my dad knew more than the ABCs was the flow of fish through his cannery. And so here I was bringing him photos, having him tell me stories. And that, in many ways brought me back my dad. And so to people like Carvel and Shirley here, they helped, bringing back my dad. And so what all of this is, this whole 7 years, has been our way, to give back. And what I've learned, both professionally and personally, is that whether originating from California or China or simply upriver, Cannery people collectively shaped our history and connected Alaska to the world. So the N Cannery, originating as a saltery, was built by the Arctic Packing Company in 1890. The Diamond N Cannery is situated on the south shore of the Naknek River. It's one of 5 major rivers that constitutes the famed Bristol Bay fishery. And just as strong runs of salmon supported canneries, the salmon provided a stable resource for native communities who lived there. And in 1894, the one-time fish packing company rivals, they merged, and they formed the San Francisco-based corporation, the Alaska Packers Association, which absorbed the Naknek River saltery and converted it into a cannery in 1895. APA assigned the cannery the initials NN for Naknek. And so it sounds really romantic, the diamond canneries, but it's really an accounting term. So the chevron there means at, like an Army email. So Diamond E was at Igigik. Diamond PP was at Pilot Point. Diamond N was at Nushagak. And this, of course, was at Naknek. And so South Naknek really becomes part of the famed diamond canneries. And expanding quickly, APA, whose parent company was CalPac, owner of the universally known brand Del Monte. They dominated Alaska's salmon market, accounting for 70% of the total salmon pack, owning or controlling 90% of its canneries. Industry insiders refer to the corporate owners as influential Western decision makers and empire builders. And the monikers pretty much fit because before 1937, APA diamond canneries produced more revenue than all minerals mined in Alaska, including gold. So in fact, they canned enough salmon to feed every man, woman, and child in America 4 pounds of salmon a year. So if you lined up that amount of cans end to end, the 1 pound tins would have circled the globe. It's a lot of fish. As Alaska anthropologist Alan Boris once observed, canneries transformed this entire area and represented the industrial revolution of the North. By the mid-20th century, the canned salmon industry represented the largest investment of capital, the biggest annual financial yield, the greatest employment of labor, the largest single source of territorial revenue, and became the dominant factor in Alaska's political, economic, social life the early 20th century. Because, here in Juneau, you guys don't know anything about fish traps, right? Right? This is like big statehood kind of stuff. Companies like Alaska and its Mad Men marketing team, they shaped the way Americans bought and prepared food. They influenced federal management of Alaska's salmon fishery. They supplied food to troops fighting in Europe during World War I. APA provided health care to residents inflicted by the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic, one of the single greatest human catastrophes of the 20th century. And during World War II, the salmon industry found itself positioned next to a major theater of war. And of course, at the center of the Alaska fight for statehood. Right? Something you guys know very well here. And through it all, the NN Cannery canned fish. A lot of fish. With the exception of 2 years during World War II, APA operated the Diamond NN Cannery continuously for 87 years. In 1982, APA dissolved. Ownership shifted to the agricultural conglomerate ConAgra. And then in 1995, the year of the cannery's centennial, its 100th year anniversary, Trident Seafoods became its sole owner. The NN Cannery operated for over 100 years, making it really exceptional. It's one of the longest running canneries in Alaska, and it offers us an opportunity to really understand the history that took place inside these buildings. So today, the rusted corrugated tin and discarded machine parts, the broken boardwalks and the skeletal remains of bunkhouses, these are the enduring reminders of the past that give voice to the cannery people. A community of laborers whose origin stories exist along the Pacific coast and across the ocean, and who today are practically invisible to the historic record. Before 1930, APA hired, through Chinese contractors, workers from China, but also the Philippines, Japan, as well as Mexico, Puerto Rico, the Iberian Peninsula, and African-American workers who were categorized separately from white workers. And although they worked and fished for the canneries, the Alutiiq, Ununga, and Dena'ina, Yupik laborers, they were not officially counted. This is a story that immediately puts Alaska in a contemporary immigration story, and it begs the question, why were some workers remembered, others enumerated, and others forgotten and erased from local memory? These questions are what Mug Up asks and, at least attempts to answer. So what is Mug Up? How many people tonight knew what Mug Up was? Nice, good. Mug Up. The exhibit title is inspired by this really unique cannery experience. In cannery parlance, the curious terms means coffee break. Mug Up fueled exhausted cannery workers with caffeine and pastries, provided a reprise from the monotony of the slime line and the patching table. And most importantly, Mug Up momentarily brought people together, people from all parts of the world. Brought us here tonight, so that's pretty cool. Simply put, Mug Up speaks to the diversity of various perspectives reflected in the cannery workscape. The Mug Up exhibition that we have all worked on, just trying to do an exhibit on canneries is hard because there's so many assets you could take. Chronologically, to tell this story would be almost nearly impossible. Do you tell it geographically? Do you tell it through the political lens, environment, corporate? There's so many ways. So what we decided to do was to take you on a journey, building by building, through this salmon cannery that has that longevity and still holds that history, taking you through each space to spotlight the labor, the social history behind one of Alaska's most significant industries. We've decided to frame it through these 3 temporary galleries and then, of course, the ancillary theater. And so what you have is an exhibit set up in 4 parts: storied salmon, working waterfront, cannery community, and the cannery caretakers theater space. Also you have is created by Naknek composer Matthew Bertner, is a complementary and strategically composed soundscape of seagulls and tides and boats and boardwalks and ravens and radio chatter and wind and whistles and machines and planes and three-wheelers and water hoses and languages and poems, songs and musings that amplify and heighten the emotion of the visitor experience. Let's see, do I have to, there we go. So there, we just caught Matthew. I'm like, you gotta get him going across the boardwalk. Actually, you want me to do it again? It's kind of fun. Oh, it didn't work. Oh, well. In essence, what the soundscape was trying to do is establish a sense of place, ensure the Cannery voices were literally heard, not just kind of metaphorically, but literally heard, and really wanted to express to visitors, again, the Cannery's lyrical language of work. So importantly, museum staff and I, as we really kind of started talking and preparing for this, we wanted visitors to really discover that rather than the Cannery machines, the Mug Up exhibit was about people. People whose stories were sheltered in the shadows of history. Giving face to the historically underrepresented is Mug Up's Cannery Chorus, an assembly of Cannery figures who, like Shakespeare's chorus and Henry V, guide visitors from building to building, introduce them to the diverse crews therein, and explain the undercurrents of the history and the significance of their collective work activities. So this salmon, the storied salmon, on entering the exhibition, visitors encounter a mug-up scene. It features an actual NN Cannery mug-up cart. And the gallery space is long and narrow, and it lends itself to that flow of the river, a river that cannery workers would have looked upon on the dock at Mug Up, where they'd watch the ebb and flow of 30-foot tides twice a day. And bolstering that scene is that soundscape that, in addition to Mug Up's languages, really immerse visitors in the sound of the river, the environment, and reinforces this really powerful message that it is our work that ultimately links us, for better or worse, to nature. And importantly, too, Bristol Bay is not sequestered in history. We're forecast to have the biggest salmon run on record. So this is a living, working story that is nowhere close to ending. And at the other end of the long gallery is this space designated to replicate the superintendent's office. And here you're introduced to the Alaska Packers Association. And oh, by the way, I put these on here to just give you an idea where the buildings are on the actual landscape. So this is where the superintendent's office would be. And centered is a oak desk, chair that the cannery superintendent sat in. And yes, we really did get that thing out at the cannery. Oh my goodness. That man right there holding it was the strongest man I've ever met, and his name was literally Crusher. We should have a shrine just to Crusher. But surrounding this table are exhibited objects associated with the superintendent and how you manage the cannery, the ledgers, the code books, bookkeeping guidelines, letterheads, APA briefcases, binoculars, radio. And accentuating the superintendent's office is the section How to Eat Canned Salmon, highlighting this distinctly 20th century story of how the commercial industry used modern advertising strategies to sell canned salmon to a nation of emerging and primarily female consumers. Canned salmon labels, world fairs, trade magazines, recipe books, war posters, and other artifacts tell the story of how the industry and their advertisers sold salmon and taught Americans how to eat canned salmon. And through the museum's unparalleled historic label collection, visitors can really see examples. You can see examples of early lithography techniques. They can learn how the artwork depicted on labels evoked the wholesomeness of the product. And this, I show this one in my class. I love this. This label is so great. How these cannery operators tapped into the mythos of Alaska, right? Because we all know that you catch salmon in the winter, right? And they arrive on dog sleds. And the midnight sun is beaming beautifully in the background all the time. And the cannery is just kind of romantically set in the distance. No harm there, nothing to see here. And of course you have that red label background. Because if you walked into a grocery store, this little mass-produced product just makes you want to pick it off the shelf and buy it. And again, because the advertisers told you, we have vitamins in salmon, which we do, it's very good for you, so eat it. But women, if you really love your family, you better feed them salmon. That is not, they really did. You know, they say, if you love your family, you know, because food is love. So it was amazingly brilliant. I cannot watch Mad Men any other way now but through this lens. So kudos to the museum staff who put this together. You guys did a fantastic job. So with the historical and economic undercurrents laid, the exhibit now focuses on the cannery work and cannery workers. Visitors are introduced to the beach gang. They learn about the work activities around the dock and the water and the boats and, of course, the fish. And exhibited nearby, you'll see a back-to-work whistle. And this is an object, you know, that really signals that mug-up is over. And it's time to go back to work. And like the cannery crew, visitors move on and they enter into the cannery's working waterfront gallery. The working waterfront is really representative of the cannery's fish processing area. And really commanding the visitor's attention is that beautiful depiction that Aaron created. And there beneath are the words, how the cannery really was a living organism because it came to life each summer and it thrived. And anybody who's worked at a cannery, you get this feeling that you're not alone. It's like a living thing, pulsating with the machines and this rising tide and the light and the sun. And so we wanted to emulate and to give you that feeling, to capture that feeling of ceaseless supply of salmon, that 24-hour light, the massive tidal fluctuations, the heaving, the streamlined rhythm of machines that energize the buildings, giving this industrial ecosystem a pulse of its own. As one cannery worker described, the cannery was that living organism because it came to life each summer and thrived. And collectively, the objects underscore how salmon canneries really represented the Industrial Revolution of the North. This isn't just some sideshow, right? This is the Industrial Revolution of the North, while the soundscape hums with the sounds of industry. And at the center of the working front section is a 1 to 25th scale model of the diamond-ended cannery. This was an extraordinary effort. Oh my God, I can't believe we got it done. The base was cut by laser cutting, and then Andrew Abayo, the artist, created the buildings using analog methods. In other words, he just built them from his brain and his memory and photos. The model really helped to solve the problem of bringing this massive cannery campus, you know, into a very fixed size museum setting. Historic architect from the Park Service, John Wattle, and artist Andrew Abayo, who also grew up in the shadow of an APA cannery at Pilot Point. They spent 2 years working on this model. And, you know, Andrew really stressed the importance of model making. And so in some ways, the model is reflective, of course, the Alutiiq culture, which had a, you know, the cannery certainly had a profound influence on in Bristol Bay communities. According to Andrew, the model aims to acknowledge through himself the indigenous use and continued presence on the land. It also shows the scale and size and complexity of the industrial landscape and its relationship to the subarctic environment. It introduces a fresh spin to the old-fashioned kind of museum diorama and in that kind of contemporary setting through Andrew. And also it really enlivens the imagination. I mean, I was helping him glue on those the windows the other day, and yeah, it was challenging, but what's incredible is it really begins to come alive. Like I could hear in the Filipino bunkhouse the sounds of, and you feel like where the wind flows and which boardwalk has that little squeak in it, and the sounds of the retorts and the steam, and it comes alive. And thanks to Andrew and his artistic skill set, he was able to give us that experience. Now, if people who visit this museum know anything about canneries, then it's going to be the story of the fish house and likely the activity of sliming fish. So for many, it is the slimer who embodies the essence of the cannery worker. When visitors enter the fish house section, the very first thing that they're going to encounter is that actual slime line from the cannery. This is a remnant, we pulled out of the junkyard. And you're going to learn about the Alascaros, the Filipino workers, and the physical attributes of butchering salmon. And purposely serving as a backdrop to the human slimers is a schematic of the iron butchering machine. That, of course, is the official name. This is a racialized machine that ended the reign of the Chinese butchers. It opened the fish house to a litany of other workers, and technologically speaking, really did revolutionize the salmon canneries in Alaska. Now, another important aspect of the slime line, as I discovered, was the power of and historical continuity of song and singing. Now, I have something special for you tonight. I'm going to sing for you a slime line song, which, is actually, I can say it out loud. Many of them you can't. But I'll sing this for you. Okay, this is a song from 1988, South Naknek version, and it's called Jeremiah Was a Salmon. And I just will apologize in advance. Jeremiah was a salmon. He never did learn to swim, but he got caught in a fisherman's net, and that was the end of him. Singing joy to the world, all the fishermen, joy to the fishies in the deep blue sea. All but Jeremy. so yeah. Well, thank you. What I found thank God I'm a historian, right, and not a singer. But what we found is that there's a continuity history of singing in canneries, which was a coping mechanism, for the monotony, and so what I found through. It was an expose. It was written in 1922 by a journalist in San Francisco who kind of goes undercover as part of what they called the China Gang at that time, which was a very multicultural group. And he actually writes the lyrics of a cannery song. And so what I did, I had a friend in Fairbanks, Paul Creechy, and he's a musologist, and he studied maritime music, sea shanties. And I said, hey, do you think you could put this to song? What would you do? And I'm going to play for you tonight a much better song than mine.
Frowsy, lousy crew, as a headwind ever blew. The scrapings of 5 continents and more. They have gathered us and shipped us, and a dirty job they slipped us. A good 2,000 miles from home ashore. To Naknek to Togiak and Coffee Creek, to Tundra Flats and mud of Bristol Bay, to Cagion and Diggy Dick, Wood River Snake and Nushagak, Wind Skeeters, Drizzle, Slave, and Rotten Pay. Fore and aft in this rolling leaking craft, for a fishing like Ike Walton never knew. For we are off to harvest salmon for our masters, man and mammon, and we'll work from hell to breakfast till we're through!
So they did much better job. But it also is important because it also recognizes that many of the cannery workers that Max Stern, this journalist, was writing about were African Americans. And so again, that continuity, it really, through music, connects us through the ages. So following the flow of the fish, visitors encounter the egg house. And here you're going to learn that it was the Japanese roe techs who oversaw the preservation of the salted salmon roe. Those polythene lined and even wooden plastic roe boxes. These are really familiar reminders to anyone who ever worked in the egg house. Visitors, you're going to learn about the how the egg roe market started, how women entered the cannery workforce, and how the egg house really became one of the most lucrative parts of the cannery at a time when the salmon fishing industry really collapsed in the 1970s. And in fact, how the Japanese really become power brokers in the commercial fishing industry here in Alaska. So the cannery cooling shed, the tail-off area, the cannery itself. Here you're going to learn about the actual canning, how it took place. And highlighted here are stories that contributed to the costs of the industry's technological advancements, how they pushed out some workers and brought others in. Visitors will encounter cannery work before mechanization and the cannery work after, and specifically the story of the people who conducted this really highly skilled work. The cannery section segues into a section that conveys how the canned salmon was cooked. You'll learn about the historical and technological processes of cooking canned fish. Anybody who's canned food at home is really the same kind of idea, same process. But also the skill used in detecting the defective cans and how important the quality control workers were. And also in this area, the tail off, I never knew what that was. Tail off, it's like, whoa, that's where you cut the tails off the fish. No, it isn't. It's a machinist term, which means the end of the processing line. So it was the end of the process. And here we had many of the Alaskan, they were transient Alaska Native workers because they came from places beyond Bristol Bay to work in the canneries during especially the Union days of the 1960s. Now from the retort section, it segues into a recreated historical scene, and in the back is a photo from John Cobb. They're labeling salmon, and featured is a recently restored labeling machine on loan to us from the Alatak Cannery in Kodiak, so big shout out to OBI for getting that to us. But again, going back to the photo, there's an African-American worker who, as visitors, I hope you learn, is that many of these forgotten groups labored in canneries, especially before World War II. Most people have no idea. Puerto Ricans, Mexicans were the biggest group of workers to work at the cannery. And so, we're hoping that they are not forgotten. Here, visitors will visually be informed of how Alaska's high-grade salmon definitely was shipped to places all over the world, England, Italy, Mexico. But some of the canned salmon that was not high grade was sent to what they called the third world canneries or countries, as well as to places in the South. And so you see this evidence through their labels, that they were racialized and they were selling to the South, both the white Southerners and the African American Southerners. Again, this really highlights the economic, exploitive, and highly racialized way in which African Americans were linked to the story of the canned salmon industry. But they're linked, and that's important. They were a part of this. And visitors then enter an area where we represent the shops, the port engineer, machine shop, carpenter shop. This was the monkey wrench gang and included assortment of carpenters, plumbers, shipwrights, machinists, electricians, blacksmiths, port engineers, and stockroom men. I love this photo because a friend of mine reminded me that if you had a tool and you just walked around the cannery like you knew where you were going, no one would ever bother you because you were working. And the other thing too about what the exhibit tries to do, the canneries are pretty uniform. I'm sure if you've ever been to Kodiak and been to a cannery, you'd find this familiar, or places in Southeast or Prince William Sound. The canneries were fairly universal and uniform. But what's important is that these cannery workers left behind these kind of anonymous expressions of their relationships and their work. And so the artwork is all over the place, which is just like this was in the cleanup crew's room, this giant illustration of rain gear. And then the woman was right in where it would be the cannery bunkhouse, right at the level where a bunk bed would have been, a sweetheart back home. And then, of course, Croatia gained its independence in the 1980s, big celebration, and you see the Croatian flag everywhere in graffiti. So this is the cannery community, the space, where people who work together form these relationships, right? And I know. As you enter the cannery community, you really do see how these diverse laborers, despite the barriers, form these really meaningful relationships. Here, visitors encounter the mess hall. And here they're circled because there were several mess halls, because many of the mess halls were segregated. You also had support, like they had a barn where you would bring up your cows or not your sheep and your pigs, and it's the mess hall, which is really a focal point of the cannery space. Mealtime, it empowered cannery workers with calories, but it also empowered workers through equal rights battles because it was the center of Supreme Court cases. With the segregation, you can't do that anymore. And it was a young group of Filipinos who said you can't. And they took their case all the way to the Supreme Court and they won. And so this cannery has been around long enough to see the segregation, but also the desegregation and the integration that occurred afterwards. So it has the old white mess hall. It's now in ruins, but we have these spaces where we see how people came together. They ate together, they ate communally, and the table really invites visitors to really learn about these stories of the mess hall. And then the laundry. The laundry section, it's an important space for knowing how the local Alaska Native women and how they entered, even came to control cannery workspaces. Yes, I see you, Shirley Zimmerman over there. So visitors here will learn how the laundry was really a crucial cannery service. I mean, they're cleaning fishermen's laundry, which you deserve a medal, man. But also the beach gang bosses and the carpenters and the machinists, and so they can just focus on work for the 4 weeks that they need to get the job done. And so these women provided a crucial workforce while they were working moms, because many of the men were out fishing, and so the women not only cared for the cannery workers, but they were caring for their own children too. And also in this space, you'll learn about the set net fishery, which really begins along the south shore of the Naknek River, where the local community said, we want to fish. Many of the men were fishing in boats, but the women weren't, and their children and the elders. And so the set net fishery, which is really just you're anchored on shore rather than in boats, they went out and fished. And one of the local women said, that's why women of Naknek, South Naknek, have such long arms from carrying fish. That's why our shirts come up to here all the time, which I found this photo. I was like, oh my God, you're right. And then you move into a space into the China House. And the China House is really meant to represent from 1910 to 1920. It illuminates the experience of the Chinese as well as Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Polynesians, African Americans. I would have loved to just take, because those buildings are still standing and there are graffitis all over it. But now that it's a National Register, probably not a good idea. But that really is what's left, are these etchings on the wall. And of course, with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and the dwindling of a generation of Chinese workers, the so-called China gang of laborers really become this very diverse group. And the China House offers a firsthand account into these oft-forgotten workers. So the soundscape includes songs that really bring this disparate China House workers together and how they coped, right? We know that opium was part of that coping as well as music. And sometimes they didn't make it out and they gave the full sacrifice. The price of salmon was high. And so at the cannery, you have a Chinese graveyard, which interestingly was integrated because you also have Mexican workers too. And then next to it is a bunkhouse scene from circa 1970s, right? It's kind of a party atmosphere. Cannery workers, it's bright. The atmosphere's light and festive and fun. And this section is representative of this mixed-gendered, multi-ethnic social community. This space really does share the stories of a new generation of laborers. And yeah, it seems like a kind of a party-like atmosphere. Maybe it's a little superficial. But here's the thing, you have to look at the 3 doors. There's 3 doors taken from what was the Filipino bunkhouse, the Cannery Crew bunkhouse. And on those doors are stories of opportunities. So the first door explains how the Filipinos, how the Filipinos unionized, how they ended a corrupt contract system. The second story shares the story of how native fishermen were pushed to the margins, and especially after the fishery shifted from sail to motorboats in 1951, and how that socializing with the Italian fishermen, who were equally targets of ethnic discrimination, how that led to kind of an unlikely alliance. You'll notice that Trifont has a can of peaches right there, and it's because the Italian fisherman would always bring his parents canned food at the end of the season, and he says, to this day, I just eat the canned stuff. And then the women. After 1972, the Equal Opportunity Act is passed. Canneries are hiring more and more women, and it was not easy, if you can imagine. A woman working in a cannery in the 1970s. In fact, it was a woman who told her story of like 1976 working in the cannery. She said, you have to learn the language of work, and you have to learn how to work hard. And that's And that's a language that people who know how to work hard understand. And so it was kind of moving through that. And so, that lighter bunkhouse scene, the scene that I actually experienced when I was a kid, these people gave us, they fought through those barriers, and they allowed us to have that experience. They literally gave us, the right to party, I guess. I can't believe I just said that. But yeah, BC boys. But it is true, so you just can't take things for granted, because you don't know who came before you. And hopefully what we're trying to do is remind us of that. And then you have, you move into the story of the Winterman. And from a local perspective, you learn about how the cannery life was like in the off-season. This section highlights that Winterman's off-season duty as a storekeeper. And of course, the store was a vehicle for delivering the cash economy into rural Alaska villages, but also other kind of vehicles. Sure, absolutely, the canneries transformed native life, but native life also figured out how to use it for their own uses too. So the Honda, when the Honda 90 it was introduced, it was a revolution. It was used in the set net fishery for a lot of it. But the thing is, it was advertised for a recreational vehicle for kids, which is like crazy. But they were using it as a work tool, and they made a lot of modifications, like putting being able to have a trailer on the back and a hitch, and it was Carville's dad who came up with a lot of these innovations. And Honda Corporation came out to South Naknek and took a look at these modifications and introduced them on later models. So it was pretty cool. So this is really a story of innovation and ingenuity and know-how of the local community. And again, it's a 130-year-old cannery. Many of the buildings are still standing, and that is a testimony to the local community who cared for that place because it mattered to them too. And finally, you're going to come to a section and learn about the Cannery Hospital. Oh, there's Carville right there. So, very cute. So you're going to learn about the Cannery Hospital, and here you'll encounter a space really designed to replicate the Cannery room, a sparse room, which is suddenly filled with voices, and it's intended to kind of transport you back in time. These are voices representing Dr. Linus French, the APA Superintendent, J.F. Heimbuckle, the NN Cannery Medical Officer, Dr. Frederick Spencer, Captain Dodge of the USS Steamship Ononga. And what they're doing is recounting the story of the Spanish flu pandemic as it arrived to South Naknek. So the Spanish flu was already there when the ships showed up. In 1918, it hit, and then everybody relaxed, and it came back. And the canneries all had this cannery had a hospital, dedicated health care for the workers and the local people, because it was good business. And all of a sudden they're in a catastrophe, a human catastrophe. And APA documented this through reports. Bristol Bay was hit harder than just about anywhere in the Americas with the people. We don't really know how many people died, but we do know through these reports that the cannery superintendents, and because they had world-class communication system at the time, they were kind of the ones who were reporting this, trying to work with the federal government to bring relief. And in the outlying villages, the parents, people my age, were all dying from the Spanish flu pandemic and leaving behind their children. And so the cannery superintendent sent the doctor and the nurse up to these villages where they buried the dead and brought the family back to the cannery. And what's also extraordinary about this, a couple years ago, the great-grandsons of J.F. Heimbuckle, the superintendent, contacted me. And they had all these photos and all these stories. And so I said, hey, you want to participate in this project. So when you watch the film on the Cannery, the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic, you'll hear the voices, and those are the voices of the great-grandsons of J.F. Heimbuckle. And also what's important is, we did do a showing and with J.F. Heimbuckle and with the communities, and bringing these people together. Our whole lives are intersected because of the decisions that were made in 1919, because that is the origin, really, of South Naknek, modern South Naknek today. And then you'll see how Bristol Bay responded to another pandemic. And I had the opportunity to talk with the vice president of Trident Seafoods, Vic Schreiber. I was telling him this story in October of 1919, right before, sorry, starting to get tired, 2019. And, talking about the role that the companies played in the healthcare. And that did help inform the decisions that were being made in the fishery in 2020 when the coronavirus hit. And so people are mindful of the history that came before them. And so in some ways, history matters. It might save your life someday. Finally, you'll encounter this net loft space, the Fisherman's Net Locker, which displays an array of artifacts, fishing gear, a lot of stuff. I think they were shocked that they actually got it all in there. And at the center is this net hanging bench. And immersed in the scene is a short video of Naknek net hanger Marcia Dale describing how different needs dictate different ways in which nets are hung. And displayed in the background, are her tools. And like I said, these are the corks that have the names of the people engraved. And what we did is we said, okay, for $100, you can have your name engraved on a cork, and then you'd support the exhibit. But it also, what it did, they put their brothers and their sons and their grandfathers and their daughters. And so what that did is it allowed people to be part of a history exhibit. And that was validating and important to have people know that, my lifeway is now a part of history. That means a lot to people. So kudos to you guys for doing this. And finally, go check out the Cannery Caretaker film. You can also watch it online through the museum website. This is a 40-minute feature film that we did that really tells the story of cannery life through the perspective of the village. And what's also kind of neat is that the family of Scott Carter, he was out there in the 1960s, 1970s doing work, and he was a fisherman for the superintendent out there and a filmmaker and history teacher, and his family donated all his film footage to the museum and the state library, so that can be continued to be used forever, including, by the way, there's I think some footage of Don Young on the dock out there, so that could be a nice commemoration too. So in the end, we really wanted each immersive environment to give you all the chance to experience the various cannery work that was conducted by a variety of cannery people, to literally walk in their shoes, to share the perspective of cannery life through little-known stories still contained in these historic spaces. The aim for this mug-up exhibit was to move cannery workers from the shadows of Alaska history and assign that work meaning. To inspire Bristol Bay youth to be equally proud of a mother who cleans fish as a father who catches them. Whether originating from China, the Philippines, or simply upriver, cannery people found dignity through their laborious interactions, and they left a mark on Alaska history and culture. Individuals working together in a cooperative effort underscore the Aristotelian principle that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Oops. Shoot. Sorry, this is supposed to play. Why aren't you playing? I have to touch, so. My favorite mug-up scene, I have to show you. This is pretty awesome. So even for those of you who have never stepped foot in a cannery, mug-up, rather than being this kind of exotic experience, it really shows how hard work, even play, is a universal concept that connects the little-known cannery experience with familiar values shared by visitors from Washington State to Washington, D.C. We all understand what hard work is. Well, except for my 15-year-old son, which I threaten him all the time. You're going to go work in a cannery. So as we public historians develop this introspective, unique, and colorful depiction of cannery people's lifeways and history, I think it's really important that we strive to find that balance between the casual curiosity, the unfathomable local knowledge concentrated on intersections and commonalities, and to never forget the power of work and how it binds us together. So as, So as to do as John Steinbeck once wrote, our job here with Mug Up is really to open the page and let the stories crawl in by themselves. So before I wrap up, I do want to thank a few people. I want to thank, obviously, Carvel, Shirley, all the people of South Naknek who have supported me, not just for the last 7 years, but my whole entire life. Thanks to Andrew Abayo and Don Watchell, Linda Easterling, who donated the cannery floor from ECUC, which became the foundation of the cannery exhibits that you're seeing out there, not to mention all your staff that made it possible to use that wood. Tim Troll and the awesome NN Cannery project team and the museum staff who came out to Bristol Bay and helped and gave me their wise wisdom. Trident Seafoods, oh, thank God, I put that one in. He had some other ones that were not appropriate for the public. But with old Crusher, not to mention my 15-year-old son that I may come out and work too, Ben. So Bob King, of course, thank God for Bob and his wisdom and knowledge of the Bristol Bay. You guys are so lucky. Larissa Igley, who designed our website and just brought her artistic passion also from Naknek. I want to thank all my fellow cannery workers who, helped me be a much better history teacher. All the years in my classroom, this was probably the most impactful on me. And my family who, has put up with me getting up at 5 in the morning and working literally 12 hours at my computer on the weekends and just trying to put all of this together and seeing it through. And now I'm going to drive my husband crazy because I'll have weekends. It's like, let's do some projects. My dad, Gary Johnson, who I hope to bring up at the end of the season so he can have the opportunity to see his life work commemorated. So thank you all, and I hope that you enjoy Mug Up. So are there time for questions?
Time for a few questions.
Yep, time for a few questions.
Anybody have a question? Reach on the mic.
Oh, someone has to have a question.
Question here.
I got about selling the salmon to people who didn't eat salmon, like in our country. You made enough for 4 pounds for every person. Obviously, it worked. What's happened since then? I don't see people eating a lot of canned salmon off the shelf.
It's called fresh frozen. And that, yeah. Like I said, they're still catching lots of fish, right? But they just don't can them as much because there's a different market. And people want to have their beautiful salmon at their, New Year's Eve parties. And so it's just a different, but it lasted for a long time. And it was an efficient way to get beautiful Alaska salmon to England and to the Deep South or, all over the world. It was a perfect little package. And then technology changed and they figured out how to get that fish pretty quickly to all those places. So that's really what the bottom line is.
Were there places where everybody ate it? I mean, when I grew up in Idaho, I didn't remember anybody buying canned salmon. So somebody must have been buying our share.
Yeah, not so much probably in Idaho. You're right. But yeah, there were big markets. Europe was a big market. As well, like I said, the Argo salmon, which, they branded. That was like the thing, like we take our advertising completely for granted. And, they're like, okay, let's brand. Like they had all these crazy labels. They were beautiful, but, they were just like little artworks. All little individual pieces. And then they thought, let's just brand. And Argo will be our brand. And so maybe people will think, if I eat canned salmon, I'll think of Argo. Or if I hear Argo, I'll think of canned salmon. I mean, we think of that like, duh. But it's like, oh, let's try it. And then they could use the can to advertise their product. What do you think? And we'd all do it the same rather than having all these this cacophony of different labels. So it's actually brilliant. And that's one of the things I learned is how APA was one of the first companies really do that because they're all coming out of San Francisco. And the lithographic artists that came over from Germany are working right there. And they are pumping out millions of these salmon labels, but they're all the same, right? It's cost effective. But yeah, so that is in itself probably one of the most fascinating things I took away is how, part of how canned salmon really played a role in the shift to national advertising. Selling to before, if I was a grocery seller, I'd sell to you because I knew you, right? And you'd be like, well, I'd grow all my food and I take care of it and I know exactly what's in it. So why should I trust this can? So it took a while for them to convince Americans to eat canned food, processed food, all of that. So, but yeah, it's really fascinating. I can go on way too long about that. But anyway, hopefully that answered your question.
Do we have another question? Before we get started, I'm going to ask, here, you can come to the...
Several questions, of course.
Oh, good. Oh.
There's a lot of unprotected, dangerous equipment there. How do we assess how dangerous working in the cannery was? How many fingers were lost? And secondly, were the species separated? How many species were being canned there, and how were they kept separate so that the kings went in one and the reds in another?
Yeah, those are really good questions, and you're right.
Third one.
Oh, third. Oh my God, I better write it
Surely
down.
there's somebody here who knows the answer to this. What was the volume, the tons per year, or however you want to measure cases in those days compared to what we're able to pack now?
All right, I might have to bring in someone for that one. But okay, so safety. You're right, it was very dangerous. And the fishing, of course, that's why they had a graveyard. It was a dangerous job. It's still a dangerous job. But they have this thing called OSHA now, where they come in and they make sure your workplace is safe. So, honestly, you could write a whole book on the regulation history of our workplaces and our labor and keeping our workplaces safe. Absolutely. So I think that's a good question, and you're right. It could be a very dangerous. What's also interesting too is fire. That was by far their biggest fear, and the provisions warehouse is the building farthest away from the cannery where the boilers and stuff were, because they thought, well, if there's a fire, and the cannery is made of wood and diesel, so it's going to go up. At least their food stocks would be far away and that they could survive. So that's something to kind of think about. So they were, and not to mention there's fire hoses in every place you can imagine. So fire was, and that's why they had a lot of wintermen too, because it was absolutely crucial. And then, what was your second question? Species, yes. So all five species go up the river. Right. Luckily, they do sort of stack themselves. So the red sockeye come in first and hard, and then you'll get a spotting of the king salmon, which are too big to fit through the big butchering machines. So the Filipinos have excellent eyes, and it's easy to know the species once the head is cut off, but sometimes it's harder to know, especially the silvers, when you get those guys thrown in there. So, but those guys knew, and they would just sort them when they got them in there. They'd pull the kings, they'd pull out the silvers, would come more in the fall. And then when the chum, the dogfish, started coming in, they too are pretty big, but they would pull those guys. And then you would can them separately. The Filipinos would butcher the king salmon by hand and then fillet them in beautiful sweeping skills. And then they would run through the silvers and then the pinks at the end. So they would keep them all together. So they knew, so they'd wait. So that is, and then the last question, I'm going to get Carvel or Bob or Tim to answer the volume. Who's going to fight for it, that answer? Do you know, Carvel?
Lately, the runs come in at 60 to 70 million fish for Bristol Bay. A good year for harvest back in the day was 40 million, and I think last year was 50 to 60 million harvest. So the volume has come up, the harvest has come up. But back in the day, before I think the biologists and the fish managers figured out how to do it, there was a cycle. There was good years where you had a lot of fish, then there were bad years where there wasn't so much fish. I think 73 we didn't hardly fish at all.
Yeah.
And there are others, and you hear about those in the news, but I think in Bristol Bay, they really figured out how to top off and have a good year every single year. And next year is going to be probably the biggest harvest ever. But every year for the last 5 years, it's been 50, 60 million fish.
Yeah, I mean,
that's in maybe a 4-week period or less.
Yeah.
So Bob and
well, that is another aspect to this story that we just, I mean, it is the management of this fishery. And it in some ways, it's a success story, and we don't have many of those. So and in fact, you know, on the Naknek River, Katmai National Park is just upriver, and it was the fish biologists in the 1950s who were studying the salmon runs up at Naknek Lake and Brooks Lake, and they wanted to know possibly what the historic runs and going back to the indigenous use of the salmon and how big were the run size. And it was actually the fisheries biologists who engaged the archaeologists like Don Dumont from the University of Oregon, and he came out there and he just happened to find one of the biggest archaeological sites in Alaska of continued use of a space at Brooks Camp right there. And I mean, they're still finding sites. I think they're well into 1,000 different sites. And so what that tells you is that salmon, and this salmon particularly, have been, you know, for almost 5,000 years have been making their way up that river and supporting people and their lives and their families. And, you know, just so happens that my family too was supported that way, so.
We have time for one more question here.
Just briefly, do you have any idea how many actual traditional canneries are still operating either in the bay and or the state?
Well, there's only, 1 or 2 left. Yeah, Bob's got the 2 fingers up, so yeah, that's it. But there are a lot of processors, so they're freezing their fish and sending it to market. So, and they're, you know, producing things like those little vitamin pills, so healthy for your heart, you know, and all they've really diversified. So, you know, I kind of ended at 82 with the end of the Alaska Packers Association, my story, but believe me, this is a story that still continues.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for coming up. And big thank you again to the museum. Let's give them one more big